on a couple of different levels, but different than the personal that Abiola was talking about, and that is from the standpoint of human resources. If you're not in a comfortable environment, you're not performing at your best, but the organization is probably not performing at its best either, and there's the possibility that people are driven away. One of my colleagues used to ask me why I was so supportive of him in trying to get tenure. And I said, because you're an organic chemist and I hate organic chemistry. And if we lose you, we have to go through a whole bunch more interviews, and I got to go sit through a whole bunch more organic seminars I don't want to sit through. So I just as soon hang on to you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so let's move on to the next question, because most of us begin a new position with optimism and most of us begin a new position with optimism and optimism for the relationships and the output of results. So what are the warning signs of a toxic workplace? Abiola?
I suppose there's so many, right? In terms of maybe even if it start off as like, you feeling discriminated and discouraged and being appreciated for your hard work. There's also the inclusion aspect. Maybe you're being excluded by team, not being invited into things. You're asked to complete tasks that are just impossible. And you're not even being provided with the necessary or the right resources for it. It could even go as far as like, where you start getting like, it's not necessarily aggressive, but it's starting to have tones of aggression from like your emails and chats, especially like now where many of us are working from home. Our work is in our home space as well. So there's that element of it just, if you remember the definition earlier on where it starts to trickle into your personal space. And even if the whole system and the organization is more competition based, so it's more about like how much you can provide and how quickly you can provide it, more so than value the importance of relationship and trust between co-workers, and none of that exists, then I think those could be classified as like, the red flag signals of you possibly being in a toxic work environment. But I think with things like this, it all boils down to something kind of like core in you, where you ask yourself, where are you in this space? And do you feel like you're being valued? Do you feel like your contributions are important? Do you even look forward to being in that space? How do you feel as soon as you leave that space? So yeah.
April?
I think one of the biggest red flags for me in determining whether there is a toxic environment or not is how well the information flows within the organization. If you've got people who sequester information, it's called information asymmetry. Okay, and if you're being asked to make decisions or asked to do stuff that you weren't involved in the decision-making process, that is a red flag. I mean, we do have to be careful. We all come from different backgrounds and everything. I think probably one of the most valuable experiences I had when I was in undergraduate, I worked at a junkyard, an auto junkyard, for a couple of years. And it was a yard, and it was the largest in the state of California, the third largest in the United States. We used to get 1,400 phone calls a day. And this was in the day before they had the automatic, deciding where you wanted your call to go. That was all answered by one person. Okay, and when you're answering the phone 1,400 times in a day, you can't have a conversation with anybody over any length of time. And so I sat in this little glass cubicle and watched the body language. And what I would see is that the guys that were the most, that had the most turnover, which were the parts pullers, they would do stink to each other when a new guy got hired. And when they did stink to, they do things like pour oil in the new guy's toolbox and stuff until they got sorted out the pecking order. And then once they got that sorted out, everything was okay. So as women going into a male dominated field, sometimes we have to be careful that we don't take offense unnecessarily. Okay, my first job, I was, the other academics were doing stink to me, but they were also doing it to the guy I got hired with. The issues were different. They picked gender with me because they thought it might be a hot button issue with me. They picked space with him because it was a hot button issue to him. It was all, that was just how they evaluated a new person. It was, will you step up or will you fold? Are you somebody that can be relied upon in you know, if there's a conflict in the organization? Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say on that.
Well, no, what's good, then April, we'll start with you for the next as a follow-up. Even when we are aware of the unhealthy work environment, some of us must remain due to financial or career obligations. So in this case, how do we deal with the shame and self-criticism that can be associated with staying in the known toxic work environment?
You know, this came up in the conversation we had, I think, yesterday or the day before, and I was wondering, because I think, so I wrote this article, Surviving a Toxic Workplace, which you made available to the participants in this thing. And at the time this stuff was going on, at first I didn't understand what was going on, but I never felt shame about it, okay? And I think because I didn't think of myself as a victim, I thought of myself as a target, and there is a big difference between those two things. By thinking of myself as a target, the way I kind of frame it is that when you recognize a toxic environment, you give people the opportunity to change the error of their ways. And if they don't, then you leave, because you're staying in that kind of situation as a victim just keeps putting them in a position where they can continue to make bad choices towards you. That's the way I framed it for me. Okay, and then, but also the other thing is sunshine. Sunshine is always your best friend. When somebody's picking on you or when they're not keeping promises to you, that you draft something like a memo and say, this is what I understand this conversation was all about. And you make it very professional, not emotional, and you distribute it, CC it to other people in the organization that should have some information about this. I've used that a couple of times to get people to back down.
So take the power back on yourself.
Take the power back on yourself, yes. And then one other thing is to keep a diary. I was listening to a program the other day about the height of the Cold War, and part of what brought down the Soviet Union was that people documented extensively the abuses that were going on, dates, names, all that kind of stuff, and having that kind of a record can be very powerful at some point, both for yourself, but also in case there's ever an opportunity to move forward on that.
Abiola?
You know, so like whenever I actually saw the question, I thought of it a little different in terms of like, I went into more the concept of shame in itself and where shame comes from. So shame generally is like, you know, where you're thinking there's something bad about you, or you're somehow held inadequate, or you've done something. So it's kind of like the internalized version of it. And when we think about shame, say in the context of the toxic work environment, and the reality of it is, in toxic work environments, the shame that is supposed to be in that space isn't there. So the environment is not working, it is bad, it's inadequate. Whereas like when we're unable to meet the demands of that space, then we make it something about ourselves. So we think somehow, I am not doing enough, I am not good enough. Whereas that shame actually originally belongs to the toxic work environment. And whenever you're able to separate that in it for yourself, and you can see that the other sometimes two components with shame is the internalized version and kind of like the other aspect that April was talking about, where you put it back to the environment and you see that it's not really about me. So I really love the fact that, like April was saying, like, you know, document it, create a record, know it for yourself, even if you like, you know, create like an email thread around what's going on, so that it's like, there's proof, there's that part of you where you're like, actually, when I put this down on paper, there is actually something wrong with the system.
Right, yeah. Yeah, then dealing, you know, taking shame off of yourself and seeing yourself as a target, not a victim. That leads us into our next question about what are the larger systems that are in place that reinforce this toxic workplace? So April?
Yeah, I think one of the big misunderstandings at institutions like universities is that the human resources department, it sounds like it ought to be about the humans and it ought to be protective of the people that work there, but that's not its job. Its job is to protect the institution. Okay, and so it's not necessarily the right thing to do is to go to HR. Okay, you'd think that would be the way to go. You might be better off going to, if it's a maybe something like a women's studies department or something like that, if they have that on your campus, or counseling like Abiola's involved in, that might be a better place to go. But we need to. I didn't realize that till just recently that that's what HR's role is to protect the institution.
Yeah, unfortunately, sometimes you learn that the hard way by going to them. Abiola?
And it's just literally building on that, in that, like, even if we transfer away from the systems a little bit, our environment and what we've been told is, like, in general, we live in like kind of like a winner or loser type situation. So someone has to be winning and someone has to be losing. So even when we think about that back into the system always wants to remain in the winning position, and sometimes at the detriment of the people within that system. There's a book written by Richard Hale on how it's actually the society and the world that is driving us crazy, and it's not from us. And he talks a lot about like how the system uses shame as an element of control, and how it keeps us in that space. Because if we're so focused on the things that we're not doing and how we're not adequate enough for those spaces, then we're not able to actually pause and reflect on, actually hold on 1 second, it's the system that's at fault, it's the system that's not working. And I really like this book because he actually gives really practical tools on how to break it down for yourself, in terms of like where you boil it down back to who you are at the core, and how you make sense of and how you separate yourself from that system. So yeah.
What's the name of the book? You said Richard Hill.
Richard Hill. I'll put it into the group chat.
I was going to say, yeah, I was going to type it in just for everyone to have at the event. But then the follow-up from that, I can wait, Aviola's typing. What can be done to overturn these systemic flaws? Yes, such as being careful who you talk to, or even, you know, this idea, if it is such a toxic environment, your closest colleagues are not necessarily the best people to go to. They're not on your side. So what can be done to work to help, you know, not have the systemic flaws be a problem?
I think there's like, you know, there's several layers to that. Say, for example, earlier on when we were talking about, say, the reason why sometimes we have to stay in the systems, it's like for really basic and really important reasons, in terms of I need to put a roof over my head, I need to pay my bills. And I think when you frame that in the sense of I'm doing this, or I'm staying here just till I can, and it's kind of like saying that, like, you're reinforcing that the reason why you're staying in this system for this limited amount of time is not something to do with you, or it's not something to do with whether or not you're not good enough, or you don't think you don't deserve enough. It's just what's currently available to you. So I think one of the first ways to take power of the system is naming it for yourself, the reason why you are staying there, and then start incorporating things like kindness, compassion, looking after yourself within that system, until you're able to feel a lot more resourced and a lot more powerful, or at least empowered to leave the system. And say, especially with, like, say, toxic environments, it's like even sometimes boiling it down to, like, every day I'm going to do something small that will make it easier for me to leave this place as soon as possible. So that could be like enrolling in courses, expanding in your skills, just so that you feel like, okay, I'm doing this, I'm staying here because of this practical reasons, but I've set this necessary steps and things in motion for me to be able to exit this environment. Yeah.
April?
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And looking back on my experiences, so I grew up on military bases, and you don't, and there's a couple of consequences of that that's unique. And one of them is that there aren't real good role models for compromise in that kind of an environment. And the second thing is that you move so much that you never learn how, you don't really often learn the skills of compromise that you need to maintain long-term relationships. And so one of the things I had to do in a job that was really toxic was I had to be conscious of the fact that there's this issue came up. And is this something that I want to go to the mat for? Is this a battle I want to fight? Or is it something that I can let go? And when I knew that, that distinction, I could let some of these things go, pick your battles. But there are other times that, no, I'm sorry, this crosses the line for me, and I'm going to go there. Okay. Second thing about it, like Abiola was saying about identifying the reasons, I wanted to leave for a long time, for probably 6 to 7 years, but it was at a critical point in my son's growing up. And having gone to 8 different schools growing up, I knew how challenging it was, particularly when they got into junior high and high school. So I was committed to going beyond that point, or staying because of that. And that was the reason I was staying. There was something else you said earlier too about the shame, how institutions try to use shame. I remember after sending out one of these emails that embarrassed one of my colleagues, that my chairman, who was part of this toxic mix, said something to me about how this colleague of mine was very embarrassed about what I had done by sending out this email. And I said, well, nobody seemed to worry about my feelings when all this conversation was going on behind my back. And that kind of, okay, yeah, I'm not owning that shame.
Yeah, you put it back on them, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to hold up the mirror. And also, April, you brought up a good point about having a community, people outside of work. For you, it was your son, that you had motivation and that you had a support system. So it's also important that people have friends and families outside of their workspace in order to have an understanding and have people that are compassionate and can help you deal with the struggles that you have to stay for now for whatever the obligations are, but then eventually you can break out of it. And also, while you're there, be empowered to help, show a mirror and to show some people that it's not, not the best way to be doing things.
Just one more thing to jump in here, and that is that you have to, toxicity does not happen in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Okay, you have to look at the bigger organization to see what else is in the organization that might. So, for instance, I was at another institution, and when I first moved to town, one of the things I found out about that institution was, as late as the 1970s, they were exposing terminally ill children and minorities to lethal doses of radiation in defense contracts. To support contracts in defense. And I was, that's pretty toxic. I can't imagine much more toxic than that. And so that told me something about the institution that I was a part of.
But you said you had already been there?
I found out about that just as I got there. And so that was always in the back of my mind to say, okay, there is something wrong here fundamentally with this institution. There is a mark on its soul, if you will, as an institution. And so whenever I saw toxicity, I looked at not just where it was locally, but did it extend out into the broader organization? And it did.
Right, those red flags that kind of you keep in the back of your mind to keep the checklist. Yes, Abiola?
I actually was just going to add to that, in that, like, I think part of what makes you know, the whole conversation around whether an environment is toxic is sometimes people might identify someone as being toxic or one person as being toxic, whereas like it's the whole system. The fact that someone can be toxic within that system tells you a lot about the environment and how the environment hasn't put the necessary safeguarding in place to stop that sort of behavior.
Yeah, that's the way, you know, you have to just be mindful. It's hard because you're doing the work for yourself, and it's like you have to be doing extra work to keep conscious of what's going on around you. It's like you have to be a, you know, secret agent, a spy going around trying to figure everything out.
Yeah.
But also, you know, any conversation that we're going to have about toxic workspaces, we should include bullying, because sometimes bullying can be subtle, and when it's subtle, lots of times it can be excused. So aside from, you know, blatant misuse and blatant bullying, what are some other characteristics of bullying? Abiola?
Especially in workplaces, the two most common ones would be like social bullying as well as psychological bullying. So like say with social bullying, it'd be like being left out on purpose. Maybe you make a request and you're being ignored. You're having people spread rumors that are untrue about you. And then when it comes to kind of like the psychological one, sometimes that can be a lot more difficult to identify, or better yet, it's not that it's difficult to identify. You feel it in your body, but it's harder to name because it could be like someone, you know, having very unpredictable reactions to, say, the delivery of your work. Someday you might come in and they might be really ecstatic about it, and the next day you might present the exact same work, and you just never know what to expect from that type of person. Or it could be intimidation, but it's the unspoken one where it's very difficult for you to say it did happen, or this is how it happened, or even it could be something as minute as like getting like dirty looks. It's hard to put that down on email or to say to someone, because then you start to look petty or like you're trying to be difficult. But all of that in itself actually causes such strong reactions in your body. It makes you feel unsafe in that environment. And that's part of what makes it bullying. And again, I felt like it wouldn't be fair for us to talk about like bullying without even bringing it into more from like the work from home sort of environment that we're all in. A lot of people, a lot of researchers were really surprised to find that like actually just because you're working from home didn't mean that like the sort of bullying that was happening, say in workspaces, disappeared. If anything, it probably heightened, in that like they have like, you know, the extra layer or extra removal of not seeing you face to face. So they can do it more through emails, through making unnecessary demands, even something as far as like knowing that like this is the time limit that you have, and they purposely try to break that. So yeah, you know, it's unfortunate, but like it does happen in a lot of this sort of environment.
April?
Yeah, the idea of bullying, one, if you're not sure at first that it is bullying, sometimes what some people recommend is that you invite the person maybe to a coffee or something like that or tea in a place that's not, you know, that's away from your space or that person's space, and just say, you know, have I done something to offend you? Is there something here that, but I tried doing that with one of the people, and what turned out was that it became more covert. And that's when I knew, yep, this is bullying. I don't know if you planned on asking us about mobbing, but that's another aspect of this that that once I came across that term, sometimes in an organization, a colleague can be suddenly identified as a bad neighbor to everybody else, and everybody's picking on this one person. And it's not, if that person, if you're the person that everybody's picking on, individual acts can sound like, well, that's trivial. Why are you being so sensitive or so touchy? But they don't understand that sometimes it's a cumulative effect. And I've seen that happen to people. It's not always a gender thing. Sometimes it can, I'm very sensitive to the fact that sometimes it's old people want to drive out the old person because they think that they'll free up resources. And sometimes us old people have some ideas about how to beat back some of this stuff. Okay, sometimes it can be gender. It can also be cultural background. Okay, it doesn't matter, but once an organization gets into that kind of a mobbing where they all pick on one person, that can dissipate after they drive the person away, but then they'll come back again and they'll decide somebody else is a target. And so if you know that that's a thing that has been identified in organizations, it's to me, I knew what that was the minute I read about it.
No, it's important to bring that up. Yeah, Abiola?
Even just was going to add on to that, in that, like, in such a toxic environment, it's the idea of finding a scapegoat, right? Someone to put the blame on, to put the shame on, someone to kind of like take the responsibility, unfortunately, of the toxic environment, instead of like looking at it from the wider picture and in a system that's just not working.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah.
In some of the things, one of the studies I read about this, they said that organizations that are most likely to engage in mobbing are religious organizations, governments, and academia. That those are the organizations that are most likely to engage in this kind of toxic behavior.
And it's the institution element in them, right?
I think part of it is because if in a company, presumably this kind of toxicity, mobbing, driving people off, is going to undermine the profit of the profitability of the organization. Whereas in religious organizations, academia, and government, it's not profit driven. And so therefore it can be allowed, it can persist in those kind of, I suspect that that's the reason why it can persist there.
Yeah, the lack of accountability that can happen. And then following up, someone who feels powerless, again, feeling like the victim, how can they combat this bullying? I know, April, you mentioned calling people out and stuff. Abiola?
I think even as far as, so like, investigate the system. So right, in terms of what policy around this form of bullying, what policy does your company have something to begin with? Do they have a way of naming it, a process in that? Because then you're identifying the bigger problem, probably the problem that's keeping it in place. And then, like, a lot of what April said is completely important, in that, like, being able to name it, take a detailed record, go take the necessary steps. And I think even adding the fact that, like, it's important the type of story you tell yourself around it. So knowing that, like, you're the one being targeted and it's not something to do with you. It's not something that you've done, or maybe that you haven't done enough. It's more that the system is just inadequate. So being very conscious of that and how you talk to yourself around it and look after yourself within that sort of system.
It may also be useful to go to somebody like Aviola. Okay, I know when I was dealing with a personal challenge years ago that was very emotional to me, that going to a counselor who was able to help me rehearse the discussions that I wanted to have with the person, as well as being able to calibrate me. We all have insecurities and stuff, and we can't always identify that what this person did or said to us was actually bullying, and so having somebody that you can bounce this off of, not necessarily it may not necessarily be somebody in your personal life that's best able to do this for you, because if they care about you, they want to see you not be in pain. But if they can't do anything about the pain, they probably just as soon not hear about it. I mean, it's just the way people are. We all got our own troubles. But if you can talk to somebody, it can be helpful to do that.
Finding an outside resource, yeah, to get an objective point of view to see. Because sometimes, we can all be thinking that we're making this up, or we're making a big deal out of it, or, that we're just being weak and that we're not pushing ourselves enough. Because also lots of times, specifically with bullying, that's what we can be told.
Yeah.
That, and, it is the sort of thing where, especially, researchers, scientists, we're logical, but you do start to break down after a while. And you do start to question things when you've been hearing them, too many times, day after day or week after week for long periods.
Yeah, it's very easy for you to get into that sort of cycle of invalidating your experience. So yeah.
So probably in general, it's good advice to talk to a therapist or to seek counseling, just to hear objective opinion, and also see how this is possibly feeding into your personal life. Yeah. And if it is becoming detrimental and if it's unhealthy, and just start to build that empowerment to try to understand how to show a mirror or to keep the best notes and all that.
Yeah.
So then, so one day, people in the audience, if they just all of a sudden wake up and realize that they are working in a toxic environment, but again, unable to leave due to obligations, what can be done to alleviate the stress that you feel and the toll that it can take on your mental health, to get you through, knowing that you're going to leave, but as April said, it can take years because of things that are going on that lots of us can understand or have experienced ourselves. So Abiola, what are some tools? And then I'll pitch to April.
I suppose that even having a clear wind down period, so you need to demarcate, this is work, and as soon as I've left work, I'm gonna have a clear work wind down period. And this could range from going for a walk or working out or just involving yourself in an activity that you enjoy, that kind of rejuvenates you. And it marks the end of the work period, and it's kind of negotiating that boundary further, where you're very clear that as soon as it's this time, it doesn't matter what comes in. I'm not going to check my emails. I'm not going to respond to work calls. This is my own time. And it's just because what you're looking to is you're trying to create pockets of space where you can breathe, where you can almost feel yourself again. Because I imagine if you're in a toxic work environment that, you're just trying to get through the seconds, really trying to get through that day. So you want to get to a place where you're okay, the day's over. Now I finally have time to do so and so. So that way, it kind of does two things, and that you've taken time for yourself, but it also gives you time to then connect to the people and the people in your life that you might feel maybe they're getting the brunt of you being stuck in this place. You can connect with them in a more meaningful way, which in turn helps you as well, in terms of you're still getting the relationship and the support that you need from them.
I never thought of that, creating a gap, because I know from my experiences that sometimes it can be so exhausting that, I'd love to go and take a yoga class to, sweat it off and cleanse it, but you just can't. So what you said, even just going and sitting on a park bench, or if it's a rainy day, going in a cafe or sitting out, even at home, if you have a, sunroom or something, just a place to create that space. So, yeah. And a key thing you mentioned about not answering your emails, I think one thing, put down the phone. So not just emails, but apps and ringing and all of that. I think that can just help, because it's critical to keep the relationship with those around you, but most critical is keeping the relationship to yourself. Exactly. And perhaps that's where taking that space, whether, if you have the energy for a yoga class or a jog, that's great. But I know I've had times where sitting on a bench and soaking in some sun, some 5 p.m. sun is all the strength I had to kind of regenerate, to build up my power to feel how to keep going on and create a plan to change this lifestyle. April?
Yeah, in terms of the yoga and stuff, after being humbled at work, why do I need another humbling experience after work when I find my body doesn't work the way I want it to? But one of the other things that I used to do is I used to take my knitting with me to staff meetings. And I would sit there and knit because I found staff meetings incredibly stressful. All right. And so just sitting there knitting, I'm listening, I'm paying attention. But yeah, that was a truly liberated woman does whatever the hell she feels like.
Well, I was going to say, no, but you're bringing up a good point that I had learned years ago. Active versus passive hobbies and pastimes. For example, watching TV and, binge watching, which sometimes we need, that's more passive. So that can sometimes even make you feel less energetic and bring on depression. But doing something active, which is reading, or just saying, I was going to say stitching. I like to do cross stitching, or making a wool scarf, something active like that. It helps calm you down and keeps your brain active, but it also is making you feel less passive because you're doing something actually active that keeps you going. Abiola, were you going to say something?
No.
Yeah, okay. Sorry. Right, so now I was going to go through some resources. I see we do have a few questions from the audience, which is fabulous. But one thing I was going to talk about, we had already talked about, yoga or just taking a breath, nervous system regulation, because I saw one person asked in the questions that was going to be part of this conversation, so I'll throw it in now. Yeah. Did Abiola or April ever use meditation if they were in a toxic environment? What were their thoughts on meditation? So either of you, or we'll get to both of you. Abiola?
I know that I personally find, kind of grounding myself using my breath as something very useful. So taking a deep breath, kind of just checking in with my body. And sometimes I'm very even aware that there's nothing that I can do or shift to make myself feel differently, but it's just acknowledging that that's where I am at. In terms of that sort of meditation, that sort of checking in with yourself in those environments, I think it's helpful in that you're at least naming, acknowledging that these feelings are coming up for yourself, without actually trying to change anything. I think when I think people might find meditation a little bit difficult is when they're doing different forms of meditation and hope that it changes the system or it changes something for them in the system. The likelihood of that happening is very little.
April, or do you?
I thought I didn't read that as meditation. I read it as mediation, which
no,
is
and you were right. So we're getting two for one here. I made it meditation, but
yeah. Well, the mediation, I have been involved in mediation in a personal matter, but not in a professional manner. Although I did consider it when I in one particular role, I did consider doing a mediation because and I don't know. I think that can be very effective if you're talking about two people who are just having trouble talking to each other. But if you truly do have a toxic person, I'm not sure that it's going to be very helpful. It just allows some box ticking to occur to say, well, we did try this, and it may not. I'm not sure how effective it is there. I'd be open to seeing if it was effective or not.
Abiola, do you mind addressing the mediation question?
In terms of mediation, kind of very similar to what April was saying. And the one thing I'll even add further is that in toxic environments, it's probably really unsafe to do that form of mediation because there's no safety around how you share, how you can share, what would be done with what you share. So then what may end up happening is you've shared how this has impacted you with nothing being done. And even in some cases, you're being blamed or shamed for having those experiences. So I think mediation in terms of having a good party that can keep that sort of safety, that sort of boundaries, then yes, but the chances of that happening is also very slim. So I think maybe the main thing is prioritizing your safety and seeing if actually this mediation will be able to take and acknowledge what is coming up from you for you against the system if necessary.
Okay. And now the idea was to go through some resources. We do have a bunch of questions. That's what I want to get to, but we've already gone through some resources. So
Yeah.
what we were going to, talking about the boundaries of space, and then also April, you've given up some good points, how you speak up and document everything. And then I talked about meditation and breath work, and then which led to mediation. So I believe we're going to throw it to Joanne, and they're going to start asking the questions from the audience.
Thank you, April and Abiola. Topics are really resonating with a lot of us. The first question I'm going to ask you here is from an anonymous attendee. And they said, I spent about 3 years working in a toxic environment. Now 1 year since I left, and I'm in a very new and positive environment, but I feel that my confidence was so damaged that I have anxiety and paranoia in my new situation that undermines my ability to be a good colleague and do a good job. How can I move past the toxic environment in my past?
I had a postgrad who worked in a really extraordinarily toxic research group, and after she left that group and came to work in my group, to some extent it was like dealing with a severely abused child, because she was a bit twitchy. She was always expecting for me to come down on her hard, and the only thing I could do was say, no, of course you can take Easter Rock. You've got 3 adorable daughters. Okay, why should but it helped for her. I knew who she worked for. Okay, but you might have to scope it out a little bit with who you're working with, to just explain that to them. Explain to them that you're trying, that you really like working in this place and that you really are helpful, but sometimes you may be a bit twitchy because of this past experience that you had.
And even also recognizing that it's important that you allow yourself to even process some of those emotions coming up, in that, like, what I'm hearing anyways from that question was that when she's getting a normal reaction, she's almost shocked, surprised, relief, but then also that part of her is waiting for the other shoe to drop, and which is normal if that's the experience you've had in your previous work environment. So giving yourself the time and the process to heal. So like that might be reaching out to, say, even a psychologist, that might be, talking to friends and family about what's going on for you. And very importantly, letting people in work, if you feel safe and comfortable and you can have that sort of relationship with them, know that, hey, this is why it might be taking me a little longer to open up or feel comfortable or respond back. But even just allowing yourself know that, like, it was an environment that impacted you and it's normal and expected that you are having these experiences.
One other thing I would like to add to that is just that it's also important for those of us, for us all to recognize this in each other, that to cut each other some slack. I had a colleague I worked with in this place that had been one of the women that were marginalized, and that came before me in this institution, and I had said something at a meeting, and she came down to my office and absolutely exploded at me, wondering what I was saying and what I was doing. And I had to just accept that from her experiences, and just reassure her, we have to give each other that space.
Thank you, Abiola and April. I have a question from one of our attendees, Ellen O'Shea. Is intersectionality a major factor in toxicity in the workplace, where someone is othered by more than one characteristic?
100%. In terms of it gives something to target. It gives something to name and shame. It provides the system with a weapon. So yeah.
The literature on mobbing says that the people who are most likely to be targeted are people who are somewhat accomplished, but don't quite fit the organizational norms. Okay, and so when we bring diversity into the workplace, that we may be setting people up for failure if we don't take this into account.
Thank you both.
We have another question from Louise, who says, in my own workplace, the toxicity has developed slowly, and as such, I've had to put up boundaries and socializing with others in an attempt to protect my own well-being. However, what advice do you have around putting up these boundaries, as I think this can often make things worse?
And very rightly so, when people are negotiating their boundaries, they usually are met with very strong reactions from people who they are creating that boundary from, because the reason why you have to create that boundary to begin with is they're aware, almost crossing into your boundaries, doing what they wish within your boundaries. And that's why you're kind of going into that space of, hey, this is a line that I need to draw. This is something that is important for me. And this is a way that I need to be able to work. And someone who's used to, suppose, crossing into other people's boundaries, they're not going to find this or going to be very receptive to this. And I think the main advice that I'd give in terms of that is expect that reaction. That reaction is part of the conflict that is needed with you negotiating the boundaries. Resource yourself, be able to say, actually, no, this is something that I need. I know it's important for myself, and actually just stick behind that. Even if you're met with whatever reaction, be like, I hear you, I can see how this might be difficult for you, but for me personally, this is important, and you don't feel the need to back off or back down from it.
I guess the one thing I agree with all of that, but when you're dealing with a workplace bully, sometimes putting up these boundaries and stuff gets you out of the conversation. You don't get to put any input into the narrative that goes around instead, and it can in those cases get worse. Okay, and so you do that is something to keep in mind, is just, you know, yes, the boundaries are important, but you can't be totally behind the boundaries, because then you lose input into the narrative.
Hi, we have one more question from the audience. Yvonne says, hi, thank you for your insights, Abiola and April. I wish I had understood the issue sooner. I have experience working at a university as research staff, and I experienced bullying from teaching staff and had a terrible time trying to resolve the issue. Do you think university should keep records of complaints of bullying made by staff against other staff? I found it shocking that my university didn't keep any record of bullying complaints. I asked. By the way, I left the job shortly after because the issue wasn't resolved, and I think it had to do with my role and my age as someone in my early 20s. Abiola, do you have any insight?
I was going to pass that one on to April, actually, because I'm conscious.
Okay.
Yeah, the thing with the university keeping a record, that drops it back into the HR realm, and they're not going to do that. They're just not going to do that, because their job is to protect the institution. In that case, so let me give an example. When I was in graduate school, there was a faculty member who would grab female students inappropriately in labs. Okay, and the only way I found out that this was not just me was I made discreet inquiries amongst the other graduate students. Usually this kind of stuff is serial. Okay, and I think that's how this kind of stuff, if there's bullying that goes on, I wish there was a better way to do it, but you're just not going to be able to do it through HR. Maybe, like I said before, counseling office, but there's confidentiality issues there as well. So I really don't have a good answer for this one.
Thank you. I have one more question from an attendee. How do we go about addressing the system as a whole and not making this an issue of an individual target or victim? In organizations that are forced to have bullying policies and corporate communication that chastises such behavior, yet such behavior still happens, how do we go about addressing this at a level beyond individual, corporate, organization responsibility, but at the level of society?
That's a big question.
It is.
That's a very big question. I think for me personally, I think there's so much, like a huge part of me is knowing that there's so much that I have control over, in terms of there's so much I can't control other people's actions. I can only focus on what I do and how I look after myself within spaces. And I think maybe prioritizing your safety and what is important within society, and even more of us being able to say that this isn't okay for me, means that there's a huge number of people saying collectively this isn't okay. So I think it probably starts off more on an individual level before we can even get to a societal level.
Thank you.
I think some of it also can play out in as we progress in our careers, to set the tone in the organization. When I first came to Ireland, I was made director of the Irish Separation Science Cluster, and I had a young woman working for me that I could see that there was a mobbing situation developing. And I just made it very clear, this is not going to happen on my watch. It is not going to happen. I won't tolerate it. And that's the kind of thing we can do. When we're at the low rungs, there's not much maybe we can do except survive. Okay. And maybe educate ourselves as much as possible on things that we can do. And then as we move along in our careers, we set the tone. We are very clear about what we will tolerate and what we won't tolerate. It's part of the reason why I wrote that article on surviving a toxic workplace, is because I saw other people being mobbed, being bullied. Some of it were ideas I got from my own experience growing up on military bases. Military parents are really hard on their kids, okay? And so, for instance, if I knew I was going to be in trouble at home, I brought a stranger home with me. And I employed that strategy in the workplace to keep people from doing that. Participate in workshops like this where you can get ideas from other people. All of that's in the mix. But I think the other thing is just making it very clear this is not something that will be tolerated.
Yeah, and also when you talk about the earlier, I'm sorry, we're wrapping up. But when you talk about, you don't have power at the lower levels, you can at least unify voices. Talk to other people in your undergrad classes, talk to people in your postgrad classes to at least unify the voices, because maybe then they're an you guys three are more powerful than one, 5 are more powerful than 3, could possibly build like that. I just wanted to finish up the question so we can wrap up on time. And I wanted to end for the audience members that are left. I want to do one final poll asking about this. So I'm launching the poll now. The question is, did you learn something useful today to help you navigate unpleasant situations? So these answers are anonymous. You can either answer yes or no. And I see some people are launching in, and I'll give it a few more seconds because the numbers are going up, and then we'll wrap up by saying thank you. Okay, I'll close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And it says that seems like a lot of people did learn something useful today, so that's been great that we were able to help people. But we need to wrap up because of time. I'd like to thank everybody. So absolutely like to thank Abiola and April for their participation in the discussion. And this is being recorded, so even for people who haven't attended, we'll put it on our YouTube channel. And also I'd like to thank fellow Women in Research Ireland committee members helping with the questions. And also, as far as resources, we will send some. There's some in the chat going on right now, but also we'll send some in the follow-up email to the Eventbrite Ticket members. So thanks everyone for attending, And we hopefully will see you at our next event.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.